Today's story follows Sarah Hastings, a flight attendant whose snap judgment leads to a life-changing mistake during an encounter with Michael Carter, a philanthropist dedicated to helping underserved communities. Faced with her own unconscious bias, Sarah embarks on a journey of self-reflection and redemption, transforming not just her own life, but the lives of many around her. How does one mistake lead to a complete transformation? And how does Michael play a key role in Sarah's path to change? Watch to find out. Comment below if you've ever had an eye-opening moment of reflection, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of growth and inspiration. Michael Carter stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, the soft morning light filtering through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. It was early, too early for most, but for Michael, mornings were sacred. They offered him a quiet space to reflect, prepare, and gather his thoughts before diving into the relentless pace of his life. Today was no exception. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and a crisp white shirt, Michael meticulously adjusted his tie, the weight of the day ahead pressing on his mind. He stared into the mirror, seeing more than just his reflection, a man in his early 40s, tall and muscular, with a chiseled jawline and deep brown eyes that carried the weight of his experiences. He'd come a long way from the streets of his old neighborhood, where poverty was the norm and opportunities were rare. Growing up, Michael had seen firsthand the impact of systemic inequality, and as he rose through the ranks of the business world, building his wealth and success, he never forgot where he came from. Now, as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, he spent his days not just making deals, but making a difference. His company had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, but his heart remained rooted in giving back. On his dresser sat a framed photo that never failed to make him smile. In it, a younger Michael stood in the center of a group of children, all beaming at the camera. Behind them loomed the community center Michael had helped build in his old neighborhood, the place that had become a lifeline for so many. He ran a finger across the photo's edge, the memories rushing back. That community center had been his first major project, and it had changed not just the lives of the children who used it, but his own life as well. It was a constant reminder of why he worked as hard as he did, why he pushed himself even when the weight of his responsibilities became overwhelming. Another day, another chance to make a difference, Michael murmured to himself as he adjusted his tie one final time. Today's agenda was no small matter. He was flying to Chicago to speak at a high-profile conference on economic empowerment in underserved communities, a topic that was deeply personal to him. Over the years, he had spoken at countless events, written op-eds, and even testified before Congress about the structural barriers that kept certain communities trapped in cycles of poverty. But every time he spoke, it felt as urgent as the first. The stakes were high, and he knew that his voice, his story, had the power to inspire real change. Still, the pressure was immense. Being a black man in a position of influence came with a constant set of challenges: public scrutiny, skepticism, and at times, open hostility. As he moved through his house, the quiet echoed around him. The sprawling space, while luxurious, lacked the warmth of family. Michael lived alone. His work consumed most of his time, leaving little room for relationships. There had been a few attempts at long-term partnerships, but the demands of his career, and perhaps his own emotional distance, had always made them difficult to sustain. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but the loneliness crept in at times, especially in the early hours of the morning when the house felt too big, too empty. In the kitchen, Michael poured himself a quick cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma as it filled the room. As he took a slow sip, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced down at the screen and sighed. Another news article about his latest philanthropic venture had gone live. Curious, he opened the link and scanned the piece, which highlighted the new scholarships he had funded for students in underserved communities. Most of the article was positive, but as always, there were comments. Some praised his work, while others questioned his motives. Words like self-serving and publicity stunt jumped out at him. "You can't please everyone," Michael muttered, setting his phone back on the counter. Despite all he had accomplished, there were always those who doubted him, who believed his efforts were more about ego than altruism. It was a heavy burden, but one he had grown used to. It didn't make it any easier, though. Finishing his coffee, Michael grabbed his suitcase and took one last look around the house before heading out the door. The cool morning air hit him as he stepped onto the front porch, and for a moment he paused, breathing in deeply. The day ahead would be filled with meetings, speeches, and a spotlight he couldn't escape. But for now, there was peace. As he drove to the airport, his thoughts wandered to the speech he would be giving later that day. He had written it weeks ago, but he kept revising it in his head, tweaking lines, rearranging points. The conference was important, not just for him, but for the message he was trying to send. There were too many communities like the one he had grown up in, where the odds were stacked against people from the moment they were born. Economic empowerment wasn't just a talking point for him, it was personal. He wanted to challenge the attendees to think beyond charity and short-term solutions. Real change required a shift in how people thought about investment, education, and opportunity. He wanted them to see the potential in the very people society often overlooked. "You've come a long way, Carter," he said to himself with a slight smile as he navigated the busy streets. But even with all the progress he had made, there was still so much more to be done. Across town, Sarah Hastings stood in front of her own mirror, but the woman staring back at her looked very different from Michael. In her late 40s, Sarah had spent nearly 20 years as a flight attendant, and though her job was demanding, she still loved the sense of adventure it gave her. But there were days when it felt like too much. Too many hours, too many passengers, too much pressure to keep smiling, no matter what. Today was one of those days. Sarah lived alone in a modest apartment, far from the glitzy lifestyle some might associate with airline employees. She had grown up in a small, mostly white town in the Midwest, where diversity was more of an idea than a reality. Her parents had been good people, but they had raised her with a certain set of beliefs about the world. Beliefs that, while never overtly hostile, had planted seeds of discomfort in her whenever she encountered people who didn't look or act like those she had grown up around. Sarah had never seen herself as prejudiced. In fact, she prided herself on being polite to everyone, regardless of their background. But the truth was, she rarely questioned her assumptions or the little thoughts that crept into her mind when she interacted with passengers who didn't fit the mold of what she considered typical. If asked, she would have said she was open-minded, fair, and professional. Yet there was a part of her, hidden deep down, that felt uneasy when she was confronted with anything outside of her narrow view of the world. As she applied her makeup in the dimly lit bathroom, Sarah couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her stomach. The flight to Chicago was going to be long, and she had a first-class assignment, which meant dealing with passengers who often had high expectations and little patience for mistakes. She didn't mind first class, but it was definitely more stressful than the back of the plane. "Just another day," she muttered to herself as she finished applying her lipstick and ran a brush through her hair. But deep down, she knew today felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a tension in the air, as though something was waiting to unfold. She shook off the feeling and reminded herself that she was a professional. She had handled worse flights. She could handle this one. After grabbing her bags, Sarah locked her apartment and headed to the airport. As she drove, her mind wandered, reflecting on how much her life had changed since she first became a flight attendant. She had loved the job in the early years. The travel, the excitement, the sense of freedom. But now the novelty had worn off. It had become routine, even monotonous at times. There were still moments of joy, of course. Watching a child's eyes light up as they flew for the first time, or helping an elderly passenger who was nervous about traveling alone. But there were also days when she felt disconnected, going through the motions without really connecting to the people around her. Today felt like one of those disconnected days. As she parked her car and made her way through the employee entrance at the airport, Sarah steeled herself for the shift ahead. First-class passengers were often demanding, and she needed to be on her game. But the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. Something was off. Michael navigated the airport with practiced ease, moving through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this countless times. He checked his watch. He had time to grab a coffee before the flight, but he didn't feel the need. The adrenaline of the upcoming conference was enough to keep him alert. Besides, airports were always a strange mix of excitement and exhaustion for him. He liked energy, the sense of movement, but there was always an undercurrent of stress that followed him from one gate to the next. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, he smiled warmly at the attendant, who greeted him with a polite nod. Michael handed over his ticket, and the process went smoothly. He was used to the attention his presence sometimes drew. A black man in first class wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't common either. He was accustomed to the looks, some admiring, some curious, and others skeptical. But he'd learned long ago to let it slide. People could think what they wanted, he was there to do his job and nothing more. The attendant handed him his boarding pass, and with a final nod, Michael made his way down the jet bridge. His thoughts drifted back to his speech. He had spent weeks refining it, shaping it into something that would resonate not just with the business leaders and policymakers at the conference, but with anyone who had ever felt left behind by the system. He wanted his words to inspire action, not just applause. When he stepped onto the plane, he immediately caught the eye of Sarah Hastings, the flight attendant assigned to first class. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she noticed Michael, a tall, confident black man in a tailored suit that screamed success. For a brief moment, something inside her tightened. She quickly shook it off, offering him a professional smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Michael returned her smile with a nod. "Good morning," he replied, his tone warm but distracted as he moved down the aisle to his seat in first class. As Michael settled into his seat, Sarah found herself stealing glances at him. It wasn't anything overt, but there was something about him that made her feel unsettled. It wasn't just that he was successful. She had served countless wealthy passengers before. But this was different. She couldn't help but wonder, how does someone like him afford first class? The thought startled her, and she immediately pushed it away, ashamed of herself for even thinking about it. She prided herself on being professional and impartial, but the thought lingered no matter how much she tried to dismiss it. Meanwhile, Michael busied himself with his work, pulling out his laptop and reviewing his notes for the conference. He barely noticed Sarah's discomfort, too focused on what lay ahead. He had learned long ago to block out distractions, to keep his eyes on the goal. As the plane filled up and the other passengers in first class took their seats, Sarah tried to focus on her duties. She moved down the aisle offering drinks, helping passengers store their bags, and making sure everyone was comfortable. But each time she passed Michael's seat, her mind kept returning to the same question. There was no reason to doubt him, no logical basis for her unease, but it was there nonetheless. Her interactions with Michael were polite but stilted. Each time she spoke to him, she felt a slight tightening in her chest, an internal struggle between her professional training and the biases she had never fully confronted. She didn't understand why, but something about him made her feel on edge. Was it because he was different from the other passengers? Or was it something deeper, something she didn't want to admit? As she served the other passengers, Sarah tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back, undermining her sense of control. She caught herself watching Michael more than she should, wondering why he seemed so at ease, so comfortable in a space she had unconsciously reserved for people who looked a certain way. Michael, unaware of the growing tension around him, continued to work quietly. He glanced up occasionally, offering a polite smile to the other passengers or to Sarah as she passed by. He had learned long ago how to navigate spaces like this, spaces where he was both seen and unseen, where he had to prove, again and again, that he belonged. The flight had barely begun, but the stage was set for something neither of them could anticipate. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the hum of the plane's engines filled the first-class cabin with a steady, almost soothing rhythm. Passengers settled into their seats, some reclining with their drinks, others immersed in books or work. For Michael, it was a chance to mentally prepare for the conference ahead. He adjusted his laptop to the tray table in front of him, fingers flying across the keyboard as he refined the final points of his speech. In the row behind him, Megan Daniels, a young woman in her mid-20s, fidgeted nervously. It was her first time flying in first class, and she was feeling out of place among the polished business travelers. Every time Sarah passed by, Megan glanced up nervously, unsure of what the etiquette was for asking for something or even making a simple request. Her anxiety had been mounting since the plane took off, and she clutched a book in her lap, though she hadn't managed to read a single word. Sarah, meanwhile, was making her rounds through the first-class cabin, her usual efficiency somewhat hampered by the lingering unease she felt toward Michael. She had tried to brush it off as nothing more than exhaustion from a long week of flights, but it stuck with her, growing into something she couldn't easily dismiss. The more she tried to focus on her duties, the more her thoughts returned to him. As Sarah approached Michael's row, Megan leaned forward slightly, trying to shift in her seat. In her nervousness, her elbow slipped, brushing lightly against Sarah's arm as she walked past. It was a brief, harmless touch, something that would have gone unnoticed on any other flight. But Sarah was already on edge, and the unexpected sensation startled her. Sarah turned sharply, her gaze landing on Michael, though he hadn't moved. The sudden jolt of tension in her chest made her jump to conclusions she didn't fully understand. Without thinking, her discomfort and assumptions coalesced into something irrational, something she couldn't quite control. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended, her posture stiffening as she addressed Michael directly. Michael looked up from his laptop, confusion flashing across his face. "Yes?" he asked, his tone polite but tinged with surprise at the sudden attention. The cabin fell silent, passengers nearby subtly turning their heads toward the exchange, sensing something off in Sarah's tone. For a brief moment, the atmosphere shifted from relaxed to tense, the energy in the room changing like the flick of a switch. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right," Sarah said, her words hanging awkwardly in the air. Her heart raced as she realized she didn't even know what she was implying, but something in her just couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong. Michael blinked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Everything's fine," he replied, his voice steady. He was clearly taken aback but remained composed, unsure of where this sudden attention was coming from. But Sarah didn't retreat. There was an uneasy tension in her posture, her expression tight and her voice slightly strained. It was clear to the nearby passengers that this wasn't a typical interaction. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together why she had even felt the need to address Michael in the first place. She had served countless first-class passengers over the years, and yet this moment felt different, unsettling. Megan, still sitting behind Michael, shrank back into her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to cause any disturbance, but she suddenly realized that her small, accidental bump had triggered something far bigger than she'd anticipated. Megan's eyes darted around, wondering if she should say something, but too scared to draw attention to herself. Sarah stood there, unsure of how to proceed. Her mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts, her professionalism telling her to walk away, but a deeper, unacknowledged bias made her second-guess herself. She felt as if everyone in the cabin was watching her, and for a moment, her years of experience and composure seemed to slip through her fingers. Michael, still seated, watched Sarah with growing confusion. He had done nothing, said nothing, yet here he was, being scrutinized in a way that felt all too familiar. He had seen this before, small moments of prejudice, often unspoken, yet unmistakable in their impact. His chest tightened slightly, not in anger, but in frustration. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," Michael said finally, his voice measured, though his eyes reflected a calm that was beginning to harden into something more resolute. Sarah hesitated, her heart racing. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, and yet she didn't understand why she couldn't simply walk away and move on. It was as if some invisible force was pulling her back, making her stay rooted in place. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. Passengers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Some looked toward Michael with confusion, while others glanced at Sarah, wondering if they had missed something. The entire atmosphere was charged, and yet no one fully understood why. I just thought," Sarah began, but her words faltered. She didn't know what to say next. Her mind was racing, trying to justify her behavior, but there was no justification. The truth was, she had made an assumption, a quiet, almost subconscious one, based on nothing more than a feeling, and now she didn't know how to undo the situation she had created. Before the moment could stretch any further, Megan, feeling the weight of the silence, gathered the courage to speak up. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small but clear. "I think I accidentally bumped into you. It wasn't him." Sarah froze, the words hanging in the air like a cold gust of wind. She turned to Megan, her face flushing with embarrassment. The reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. Megan's simple explanation unraveled everything. The cabin remained quiet as the passengers processed what had happened. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Sarah had overreacted, jumping to conclusions that were rooted not in reality, but in her own discomfort. The realization hit her hard and she felt a sinking sensation in her chest. I, I see, Sarah stammered, her face pale. She glanced at Michael, who remained calm but visibly tired of the situation. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." Michael offered a small nod, his expression steady but distant. "It's fine," he said, though the weight of the moment was clear in his voice. He returned to his laptop, but the energy in the cabin remained charged with tension. Sarah stepped back, her mind reeling from the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She had made a mistake, one born from an assumption she hadn't even fully realized she held. As she continued down the aisle, her hands trembling slightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just exposed something in herself that she had never wanted to admit. As Sarah retreated toward the galley, the tension in the cabin remained. Passengers whispered quietly to each other, unsure of what to make of the strange interaction they had just witnessed. Some had seen it for what it was, an overreaction based on bias, while others remained confused, wondering what had prompted Sarah to act the way she had. Megan, still seated behind Michael, felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She hadn't meant to cause any of this, but her small action had set off a chain reaction that had spiraled out of control. She wanted to apologize to Michael directly, but fear held her back. Meanwhile, Michael sat quietly, his focus no longer on his work. He stared at the screen in front of him, the words of his speech blurred by the thoughts racing through his mind. This wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this. A moment where someone had assumed the worst about him, based on nothing more than his presence. It was a feeling that never got easier, no matter how often it happened. In the galley, Sarah leaned against the counter, her heart still pounding. She replayed the moment in her mind, each second more painful than the last. She had misjudged him, plain and simple. And now she had to face the consequences of that misjudgment. But what hurt the most wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that her assumptions had come from a place she hadn't even been aware of. She had always thought of herself as open-minded, but now she wasn't so sure. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin gradually eased, but the effects of the incident lingered. Sarah felt it with every step she took, every time she passed by Michael's row. The weight of her actions sat heavily on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had exposed something ugly within herself. The remainder of the flight passed in a strange, quiet blur. Sarah continued her duties, but her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a deep sense of guilt. Every time she moved through the cabin, she felt the stares of the passengers, some sympathetic, others judgmental. Her interactions were stiff, her smiles forced. As the plane neared its destination, Sarah knew she couldn't leave things unresolved. She had to face what she had done. She had to apologize. But the thought of doing so terrified her. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to handle any situation with grace. But this was different. This wasn't just about making a mistake. This was about confronting a deeper truth she hadn't been prepared to face. When the plane finally began its descent, Sarah gathered her courage. She approached Michael's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she stood before him. "Sir," she began, her voice shaky but determined, "I just wanted to apologize. For earlier, I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Michael looked up from his laptop, his expression calm but unreadable. For a moment he said nothing, and Sarah felt the silence stretch painfully between them. Finally he nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for your apology." Sarah felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that an apology wasn't enough to fix what had happened. She had made a mistake that went deeper than just a misunderstanding. It was something she would have to reckon with long after this flight was over. As the plane touched down, Sarah returned to her duties, but the weight of the moment remained. She knew this was only the beginning of her journey toward understanding, toward the biases she had long ignored. As the plane taxied to the gate and passengers began gathering their belongings, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained thick with the aftermath of what had transpired. Sarah moved mechanically through her final duties, her hands steady but her heart heavy with guilt. She tried to avoid making eye contact with the passengers, especially Michael, who had remained polite but distant since the incident. The final stretch of the flight had been marked by an uncomfortable silence. The energy in the cabin had shifted dramatically from the initial tension, settling into something more introspective, yet still strained. Some passengers exchanged quiet whispers, discussing what had happened in low tones. Others simply kept to themselves, trying to distance themselves from the awkwardness of the situation. Michael, for his part, maintained a calm and composed exterior. He had spent the remainder of the flight working, occasionally glancing out the window, his mind elsewhere. While he was no stranger to prejudice, each encounter left its own mark. This one was no different. It wasn't about anger. Michael had long since learned how to handle these moments with grace, but there was a deeper sadness, a weariness that came with having to navigate such situations repeatedly throughout his life. When the seatbelt sign was turned off, passengers began standing and collecting their bags from the overhead compartments. Sarah stood near the front of the cabin, offering her usual polite goodbyes, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. She watched as the passengers filed past her, their expressions ranging from neutral to mildly uncomfortable. She caught glimpses of sympathy from some, though others seemed to avoid her gaze entirely. As Michael approached the exit, he paused briefly in front of her. There was a moment where their eyes met, and Sarah felt the weight of everything she had done in that fleeting connection. "Thank you for your service," Michael said, his voice kind but firm, the words layered with unspoken meaning. Sarah swallowed hard and nodded. "Safe travels, sir," she replied, her voice barely audible. Michael nodded and exited the plane, leaving Sarah standing alone at the front of the cabin. As the last passenger disembarked, Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. The emotions she had been holding in throughout the flight finally surged to the surface, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. She quickly blinked them back, unwilling to let herself break down in front of her colleagues. Once the passengers had all left and the crew began preparing the cabin for the next flight, Sarah slipped into the galley, needing a moment to herself. She leaned against the counter, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the flight. How had it come to this? How had she let her own unconscious biases lead her to such a terrible mistake? Later that evening, Sarah returned to her modest apartment, the events of the day weighing heavily on her. She had received a message from her supervisor asking for a meeting the following morning to discuss the incident. It was clear that there would be consequences. She could lose her job, and yet, as much as that scared her, it wasn't what weighed most on her heart. Sitting at her kitchen table, Sarah opened her laptop and typed Michael Carter's name into the search bar. She had overheard bits of conversation from other passengers during the flight, recognizing that he was someone of significance, though she hadn't fully understood who he was. As the search results loaded, she felt a deepening sense of shame washed over her. Michael Carter wasn't just any businessman. He was a prominent philanthropist who had dedicated his life to creating opportunities for underserved communities. Article after article highlighted his work building community centers, funding scholarships for low-income students, and advocating economic empowerment in disadvantaged neighborhoods. He had risen from humble beginnings to become a powerful voice for those who were often overlooked by society. Sarah's eyes skimmed through the headlines, her heart sinking further with each piece she read. This was the man she had unjustly scrutinized, the man she had judged without reason. Her stomach churned with guilt. She closed the laptop and sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just about her making a mistake on the job. This was about something deeper, something that had been sitting inside her for years, unexamined and unchallenged. She had always thought of herself as fair and unbiased, but today had shown her a different side of herself, one she wasn't proud of. As she sat there, her mind spinning with regret and self-doubt, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't undo what had happened on the plane, but she could try to make amends. She could start by acknowledging her mistake, not just to herself, but to Michael. She reached for her phone and typed out a simple, yet heartfelt email. Dear Mr. Carter, I hope this message finds you well. My name is Sarah Hastings, and I was the flight attendant on your recent flight from New York to Chicago. I wanted to reach out to you directly to offer my sincerest apology for the way I treated you during the flight. My actions were inexcusable, and I realize now that they were influenced by biases I hadn't even been aware of. I misjudged you, and in doing so, I disrespected you. I am deeply sorry for the discomfort I caused, and I am committed to reflecting on my actions so that this never happens again. I understand if you choose not to respond, but I felt it was important to acknowledge my mistake and ask for your forgiveness. With respect, Sarah Hastings. Sarah stared at the message for a long time before pressing send. She wasn't sure what kind of response, if any, she would receive, but sending the message felt like the first step in trying to make things right. The next step, she knew, was figuring out how to address the deeper issue of her unconscious biases. The following morning, she met with her supervisor as scheduled. The conversation was difficult but fair. Sarah was placed on administrative leave while the airline conducted an internal review of the incident. Her supervisor, while disappointed, encouraged Sarah to take the time to reflect on what had happened and to seek out resources for addressing bias and personal growth. It wasn't a formal punishment, but it felt like one. And yet Sarah knew this was her opportunity to turn things around. A few days later, Sarah received a reply to her email. Her heart raced as she opened the message, unsure of what to expect. Dear Ms. Hastings, thank you for reaching out and for your apology. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes, and I appreciate your willingness to do so. I believe that we all have the capacity to grow and change, but growth requires more than just words. It requires action. I'm not interested in holding grudges, but I do believe that experiences like the one we had can serve as important lessons if we allow them to. If you're serious about wanting to make amends, I would invite you to consider channeling your energy into positive action. My foundation works with underserved communities to provide opportunities and support for those who are often overlooked. I'd be happy to connect you with someone at the foundation if you're interested in volunteering. Best regards, Michael Carter. Sarah read the message twice, her hands shaking slightly. The grace and generosity of Michael's response were overwhelming. He could have ignored her, or worse. But instead, he had offered her a path forward, an opportunity to learn and grow through service. It was more than she could have hoped for. Without hesitating, Sarah replied, expressing her gratitude and her eagerness to get involved. She knew that volunteering at the foundation wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a step in the right direction, a step toward understanding, healing, and redemption. The following week, Sarah found herself standing in front of a modest but bustling community center in one of the city's underserved neighborhoods. It was one of several centers funded by Michael's foundation, providing educational programs, job training, and community support to residents who needed it most. Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and hope as she walked through the front doors, unsure of what to expect. She was greeted by Julia Matthews, the program director, who had been informed of Sarah's arrival by Michael. Julia's warmth and openness immediately put Sarah at ease. "We're always happy to have more hands on deck," Julia said with a smile, as she showed Sarah around the center. The center was full of life. In one room, volunteers were tutoring children in reading and math, while in another, adults attended workshops on job readiness and financial literacy. There was a sense of purpose and community in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but feel both humbled and inspired by the work being done. As the days went by, Sarah became more involved with the center's programs, volunteering in any way she could. She helped organize events, tutored children, and assisted with administrative tasks. Slowly, she began to build relationships with the people she met, many of whom had faced challenges far greater than her own. Through these interactions, Sarah's understanding of the world expanded. She began to see beyond the narrow perspective she had grown up with, realizing how much she still had to learn. One afternoon, as Sarah was sorting through donated supplies, she overheard a conversation between two teenage girls who were discussing the racial biases they encountered at school. Their words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut, reminding her of the biases she had carried with her for so long. But instead of feeling paralyzed by guilt, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was here to learn, to listen, and to grow. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's involvement at the community center deepened. She had become a regular presence, working alongside the staff and volunteers with a dedication she hadn't felt in years. Each day brought new lessons, and with them, a growing sense of self-awareness and humility. Sarah no longer saw herself as the person she had been on that flight, impulsive, prejudiced, and disconnected. She was changing, and the people around her could see it. Michael visited the center periodically, though his busy schedule meant that he wasn't always there. But when he did come by, he noticed the transformation in Sarah. She wasn't the flight attendant who had once misjudged him. She was someone who had taken responsibility for her actions and committed herself to personal growth. One day, Michael approached Sarah as she was helping a group of children with an art project. "I'm impressed with the work you've been doing here," he said, his voice kind but sincere. Sarah looked up, surprised but grateful for his words. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've learned so much from being here." Michael nodded. That's what it's all about, learning, growing, and helping others along the way. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the children continued their project. It wasn't forgiveness that Michael offered, at least not explicitly, but it was something better, an acknowledgement of the progress Sarah had made and the promise of what she could still become. Over the months, Sarah Hastings felt like a different person from the woman who had nervously stood before Michael that day on the plane. Volunteering work had started as a way to make amends, but it had evolved into something far deeper, an opportunity for self-reflection and genuine connection with people from all walks of life. The community center, once an intimidating space where she felt out of place, had become a second home to her. Through the relationships she built with the center's staff, the children she tutored, and the adults she worked with, Sarah began to break down the walls of prejudice she hadn't even realized she'd carried. The conversations she had were eye-opening, often challenging her to rethink the unconscious biases she had once harbored. It wasn't easy. Some days she went home feeling overwhelmed by the sheer depth of what she had to unlearn. But with each passing day, she felt herself growing not just as a person, but as an advocate for change. Sarah's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Michael Carter saw the shift in her, as did the others at the center. What started as tentative steps toward understanding had blossomed into a genuine commitment to helping others. Sarah wasn't just there to fulfill a sense of duty. She was there because she believed in the work, and it showed in everything she did. One afternoon, while Sarah was organizing books in the children's library, Julia Matthews, the program director, approached her with a warm smile. "You know, Sarah," Julia began, "the work you've done here has been incredible. We were wondering if you might be willing to take on a more formal role at the center. You've already become such a vital part of the team." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. "You mean a staff position?" she asked, surprised. Julia nodded. "Yes. We'd love for you to join us officially. You've shown such dedication, and I think you could make an even bigger impact." For a moment, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the offer. The community center had been a place of growth for her, a place where she had faced her own biases and learned to see the world through a different lens. Accepting a formal role here would mean committing to this new path in a way she hadn't fully considered before. "I don't know what to say," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with emotion. "I'd be honored." As Sarah settled into her new role at the community center, she found herself embracing the challenges and responsibilities with enthusiasm. She had spent so many years going through the motions in her old job as a flight attendant, but now, for the first time in a long while, she feels like she was making a real difference in the world. Her days were filled with organizing programs, mentoring children, and coordinating volunteers. But more than that, she found herself becoming a voice of change, not just within the center, but in her own personal circles. She began sharing her story, not in a way that sought pity or absolution, but in a way that encouraged others to look inward and reflect on their own biases. Sarah's old friends and coworkers were curious about her transformation. Some had heard about the incident on the plane, though few knew the full details. One evening, Sarah found herself sitting with Rebecca, a former flight attendant colleague, over coffee. Rebecca had always been one of Sarah's closest friends, but they had grown distant over the past few months as Sarah had shifted her focus to her work at the center. "I've noticed a change in you, Sarah," Rebecca said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "It's like you're a completely different person. What's been going on?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain everything that had happened. But she realized this was exactly the kind of conversation she needed to have, not just with Rebecca, but with others as well. She had to be open to share the journey she had been on and hope that others could learn from it too. "Well," Sarah began, taking a deep breath, "something happened a while back that really forced me to confront some things about myself, things I didn't even realize I was carrying." She recounted the story of the flight, how her assumptions and biases had led her to misjudge Michael, and the emotional fallout that had followed. Rebecca listened quietly, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding, as Sarah explained how volunteering at the community center had changed her perspective. "I realized I had so much to unlearn," Sarah said quietly. "But more than that, I learned how important it is to take action. It's one thing to apologize or admit your mistakes, but it's another to actually do the work to change. And that's what I've been trying to do." Rebecca nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "That's really brave of you, Sarah," she said after a moment. "A lot of people wouldn't have taken it as far as you have." Sarah smiled softly. "It's been a long road, but I feel like it's the right one. And I want to keep going. I want to help others see what I've seen." The conversation with Rebecca was the first of many. Over time, Sarah began sharing her story more widely, both within her personal life and in the larger community. She encouraged her former colleagues and friends to get involved with the center, inviting them to volunteer and learn alongside her. Some were hesitant at first, unsure of how they could contribute, but Sarah's passion and sincerity were contagious. Months passed, and the community center continued to thrive. Sarah had become a core part of the team, helping to lead new initiatives and expanding the reach of the programs. Her transformation was clear to everyone who worked with her, but it wasn't just about her personal growth anymore. It was about the impact she was having on others. One day, Michael Carter approached Sarah with an idea. The center was planning a large event to celebrate the opening of a new branch in another underserved neighborhood, and they wanted Sarah to speak at the event. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of standing in front of a large audience and sharing her story felt daunting. She had grown so much since the incident on the plane, but part of her still felt uncomfortable putting her personal journey on display. Yet at the same time, she knew how powerful her story could be. It wasn't just about her, it was about the message that people could change, that they could learn from their mistakes and grow into better versions of themselves. After some consideration, Sarah agreed. The day of the event arrived, and the community center was filled with people, local families, volunteers, donors, and supporters from across the city. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of excitement and hope for what the future held. Michael stood at the front, welcoming everyone and speaking about the importance of the center's mission. When it was Sarah's turn to take the stage, her heart raced with nerves, but she reminded herself of why she was there. As she stepped up to the podium, she scanned the room, her gaze briefly landing on Michael, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "I wasn't always the person you see before you today," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "In fact, not too long ago, I made a terrible mistake, one that forced me to take a long, hard look at myself." She recounted the story of the flight, explaining how her unconscious biases had led her to misjudge Michael, and how that experience had been a catalyst for change in her life. She spoke about the importance of acknowledging our own blind spots, of doing hard work to confront our prejudices, and taking action to be better. "I'm still learning," Sarah said, her voice quieting as she reached the heart of her message. "But what I've learned most is that change is possible. It's not always easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's worth the effort. And it's something we all have to commit to, not just for ourselves, but for the communities we live in." As she finished, there was a brief pause before the room erupted in applause. Sarah felt a wave of relief and gratitude washed over her. She had shared her story not for sympathy, but for the hope that it might inspire others to reflect on their own lives and make the changes they needed to. After the event, several people approached Sarah. thanking her for her honesty and courage. Among them was Rebecca, who had decided to attend after their conversation. "I'm so proud of you," Rebecca said, hugging Sarah tightly. "You've come so far." Sarah smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She knew there was still so much work to be done, both within herself and in the world around her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. As time passed, Sarah's story began to reach even further than she had anticipated. News of the community center's growth, coupled with Sarah's personal journey, started to spread, drawing attention from local media and organizations. Sarah was asked to speak at other events and conferences, sharing her experience of personal growth in the power of community work. Through her continued involvement with the center, Sarah built a strong network of people who were equally passionate about creating change. Former colleagues and friends, once hesitant to get involved, were now regular volunteers, eager to contribute to the center's mission. The ripple effect of Sarah's transformation was undeniable. Her willingness to confront her own biases had inspired others to do the same. One afternoon, Sarah received a phone call from Michael Carter. The two had developed a quiet but meaningful friendship over the months, bound by their shared dedication to the work of the foundation. Michael had always been supportive of Sarah's journey, but now he had an even bigger idea in mind. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice warm, "I've been thinking. The work you've done here has been incredible, and I believe it's time to expand it even further. I'd like to offer you a leadership role within the foundation, overseeing our efforts to expand these programs nationwide." Sarah was stunned. She had never imagined that her journey of personal growth would lead her to this point, a position where she could help create real, lasting change on a larger scale. I don't know what to say," Sarah replied, her voice filled with emotion. "I never expected any of this." Michael smiled. "You've earned it, Sarah. Your story, your dedication, it's inspired so many people. And I believe you can help us take this work to the next level." With tears in her eyes, Sarah accepted the offer. She knew it would be a challenge, but she was ready for it. Her life had changed so much since that day on the plane, and now she had the opportunity to pay it forward in a way that would impact countless lives. The years that followed were filled with growth, both personally and professionally. Sarah took on her new leadership role with passion and determination, working closely with Michael and the rest of the foundation's team to expand their efforts across the country. Under her guidance, new community centers were opened in cities that desperately needed them, providing resources, education, and support to those who had been overlooked for far too long. Through it all, Sarah remained deeply connected to the work on the ground. She never lost sight of the lessons she had learned or the importance of continually reflecting on her own biases. She knew that the journey of personal growth was ongoing, and she embraced it fully, always seeking to learn and do better. In her new role, Sarah traveled to different cities, meeting with local leaders, volunteers, and families who benefited from the foundation's programs. Each interaction was a reminder of why the work mattered so much, and of the potential for change that existed within every person and every community. One afternoon, while visiting a new community center in Los Angeles, Sarah stood before a group of volunteers, sharing her story for the 100th time. But it never felt old or rehearsed. Each time she told it, she felt the weight of its significance as a reminder of how far she had come and how far she still had to go. As she spoke, she noticed a young woman in the audience, her eyes filled with recognition and understanding. The woman approached Sarah after the event, tears in her eyes. "Your story, it's my story too," the woman said softly. "I've made mistakes like that, and I've been so ashamed. Hearing you talk about how you've grown, it gives me hope that I can change too." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "You can," she said gently. "It's never too late to learn, to grow, and to make a difference." As Sarah sat in her office at the foundation's headquarters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought back to that fateful day on the plane, the day that had shattered her assumptions and forced her to confront the person she had been to. It had been a painful lesson, but it was one that had ultimately transformed her life. The community centers were thriving, the foundation's work was expanding, and more people were getting involved in the mission of creating lasting change. And Sarah, once an unlikely advocate for social justice, had become a leader in that movement. But for Sarah, the greatest reward wasn't the success of the foundation or the recognition she'd received. It was knowledge that she had become someone who could make a difference, someone who could inspire others to take the same journey of growth and understanding. As she looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, Sarah smiled. Her story wasn't over. It was still unfolding, and she knew that the best was yet to come. In the months following Sarah's acceptance of the leadership position at Michael Carter's foundation, the impact of her work continued to expand. Under her guidance, the foundation's programs began reaching new communities, places where hope had long been a rare commodity. She traveled across the country, meeting with city leaders, educators, and community activists, helping to establish centers similar to the one that had changed her own life. Each new city brought its own challenges. Some communities were eager to embrace the foundation's initiatives, while others were wary, unsure if outside help could really make a difference. But Sarah had learned to approach each situation with patience and humility. She didn't just arrive and impose solutions. She listened, spent time with the people, and understood their specific needs before implementing programs tailored to those challenges. One day, while visiting a newly established center in Detroit, Sarah met Janice Thompson, a local woman who had been leading grassroots efforts in her neighborhood for years. Janice had seen countless organizations come and go, each promising to change things but never sticking around long enough to make a lasting impact. "I've heard people like you before," Janice said, her voice skeptical but not unkind. "How do I know you're different?" Sarah paused, understanding the source of Janice's wariness. She had encountered this doubt before, and she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince Janice or anyone else. But she also knew that her own transformation was proof of the foundation's sincerity and commitment. "I get it," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I was once in a position where I didn't think change was possible. Not for me and not for the people around me. But I've seen firsthand what this work can do, and I'm committed to making sure that what we're doing here is for the long haul. This isn't just a job to me, it's personal." Janice studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'll be watching," she said with a small smile, "and I'll be here to hold you accountable." Sarah smiled in return. "That's all I ask." Over the following months, Janice became one of Sarah's most trusted local partners in Detroit. Together, they built new programs tailored to the community's unique challenges, addressing issues like unemployment, access to education, and food insecurity. It was hard work, sometimes thankless, but Sarah found it deeply fulfilling. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, part of a movement that was slowly but surely making a difference. One afternoon, as Sarah was preparing to leave for a site visit in Los Angeles, she received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end of the line introduced herself as Susan Richards, a producer for a major national news program. Sarah had been recommended by Michael Carter as someone who could speak to the foundation's work, as well as her own personal journey. "We'd love to feature you in an upcoming segment about community leaders making a difference," Susan explained. "Your story is powerful, and I think it would resonate with a lot of people." Sarah was stunned. While she had grown comfortable sharing her story in smaller, more personal settings at the community centers and with volunteers, this was on an entirely different scale. The idea of appearing on national television, telling her story to millions of viewers, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know," Sarah said, hesitating. "I've never done anything like that before." "That's exactly why it's so important," Susan said gently. "You're relatable. You're not someone who's been in the spotlight all their life. You're someone who's worked through difficult personal challenges and come out the other side better for it. That's what people need to hear." Sarah thought about it for a long moment, and as much as it frightened her, she knew this was an opportunity to spread her message on a larger scale. If sharing her story could inspire even one person to confront their own biases, to change their life or the lives of others, then it was worth it. "All right," Sarah said finally, "I'll do it." The day of the interview arrived, and Sarah found herself sitting in a brightly lit television studio, surrounded by cameras and bustling crew members. Her heart raced as she waited for the interview to begin, the reality of the situation sinking in. She was about to tell her story, one that had been deeply personal and at times painful to a national audience. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the work, the mission, and the lives they were trying to change. When the cameras started rolling, Susan greeted her warmly, putting her at ease. The conversation began with simple questions about her role at the foundation, the expansion of their programs, and the impact they had made on communities across the country. But soon the interview turned to Sarah's personal story. "You've been very open about your own journey of personal growth," Susan said, her voice gentle but probing. "Can you tell us about the turning point that led you to where you are now?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It started with a mistake," she said, her voice clear but soft. "A mistake that forced me to confront something I had been ignoring for a long time. My own biases, my own assumptions about the world and the people in it." She recounted the story of the flight, how her assumptions about Michael had led her to misjudge him, and how that experience had shaken her to her core. She spoke about the shame she had felt, the apology she had made, and how Michael's response, inviting her to take action, had set her on a new path. "That moment could have just been a bad memory, something I tried to forget," Sarah said. "But instead, it became the catalyst for me to do the work, to learn, and to change. And it's work that's ongoing. I'm still learning every day, and I think that's what's important. Acknowledging that change is a continuous process." Susan nodded, clearly moved by Sarah's honesty. "It's incredible to see how far you've come," she said. "What would you say to others who might be struggling with their own biases, who may not even realize the assumptions they're carrying with them?" "I'd say that it's okay to acknowledge those biases," Sarah replied. "It doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you human. But once you recognize them, you have a responsibility to address them, to educate yourself, and to take action. The most important thing is to be willing to grow." The interview ended on a hopeful note, with Susan thanking Sarah for her bravery and dedication to the work she was doing. As the cameras turned off and the crew began packing up, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had put her story out there for the world to see, not for sympathy, but in the hope that it could spark change in others. Several weeks after the interview aired, Sarah received a flood of messages from people who had watched the segment. Some were from old friends and colleagues, offering words of support and encouragement. Others were from complete strangers, people who had seen themselves in Sarah's story and were inspired to start their own journey of growth. One of the most poignant messages came from Kelsey, a young woman who wrote to Sarah after seeing the interview. In her message, Kelsey explained that she had grown up in a small, insular community where she had rarely been exposed to people from different backgrounds. Like Sarah, she had carried unconscious biases without even realizing it. "I saw myself in you," Kelsey wrote, "and it gave me the courage to start looking at the world differently. I want to make changes in my own life, and I'm going to start by getting involved in my local community center. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to grow." Sarah was deeply moved by Kelsey's message. It was a reminder that change could start with just one person, one moment of reflection, and one decision to do better. The ripple effect of her own journey was spreading further than she could have ever imagined, touching lives in ways she hadn't thought possible. As Sarah reflected on the messages she received, she realized that her story had come full circle. What had begun as a painful moment of reckoning had blossomed into something beautiful, an ongoing cycle of growth, redemption, and the pursuit of a better world. Years passed and the foundation's work continued to grow under Sarah's leadership. New community centers were established in cities across the country, each one providing opportunities and support for people who had long been overlooked. The programs expanded to include not just education and job training, but also initiatives focused on racial equity, mental health support, and community building. Sarah's story became a beacon for others who were looking for a way to contribute to positive change. She was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events, always sharing the same message: that change was possible, that growth was a journey, and that it was never too late to confront our own biases and take action. But despite the growing recognition, Sarah never lost sight of what mattered most. She remained deeply involved in the day-to-day work of the foundation, spending time at the centers, mentoring young volunteers, and listening to the stories of the people they served. She understood that true leadership wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about being present, about being willing to learn, and about using your position to lift others up. One afternoon, while visiting a newly established center in Baltimore, Sarah stood in a quiet corner of the facility, watching as children played in the courtyard and volunteers bustled around the classrooms. Michael approached her, a proud smile on his face. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Sarah smiled, nodding. "We both have." As they stood together, watching the thriving community they had helped build, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She knew that the work would never be finished, that there would always be more to do, more people to help, and more minds to change. But she also knew that every step forward was worth it. Her journey had started with a mistake, but it had led her to a life of purpose and impact. And that, she realized, was the true legacy of her story. The knowledge that change was possible and that every person had the potential to grow, learn, and make a difference in the world. As Sarah closed the door to her office one evening, the sounds of laughter and conversation echoing from the community center below, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The mistakes of her past had taught her invaluable lessons, and the work she was doing now was creating ripples that would continue long after she was gone. She smiled, knowing that the best way to honor the lessons she had learned was to keep moving forward, to keep growing, keep learning, and keep helping others do the same. The journey wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone. If you've been moved by Sarah's story of redemption, growth, and transformation, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Join us as we continue to explore more inspirational stories of personal journeys, overcoming challenges, and making a difference in the world. Let's keep learning, growing, and helping each other on this journey of life.